Hey, Illuminate Grace teens. Just wanted to talk to you about a new lesson here today and a concept that you're kind of familiar with in the sense that we're going to be talking about Noah today, but we're going to be talking most importantly about sin and God's grace. Now, we've heard about God's graciousness in Wednesday Night Youth Group, but let's dive into it a little bit more here. God is gracious. That's our essential doctrine that we need to learn about here today. And how does this work? Because this actually comes up in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8. And you say, yeah, well, we skipped over Cain and Abel and a few other chapters. I understand that, but this was the next lesson, jumping into this and just understanding what grace is and how it connects with Jesus Christ. So hang with me on this. In Genesis chapter 6 through 9, we're seeing some things about Noah. But in verse 8 of chapter 6, it says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And you say, okay, grace. Is this something that Noah deserved? Something that because of his good looks, all of a sudden he's going to get God's goodness and a gift here and a rescue? And I mean, we know the story. What happens is sin is ruling in a lot of people's lives, and every thought, intention of their heart is evil. It's immoral. What they want is not what God wants, and God is saying, hey, there's going to be a flood, a global flood. It was real. This is not a fake thing. This is a real judgment of God upon the sin of the world. But yet there was one follower of God named Noah. Now all of a sudden, God shows up and says, hey, listen, I want you to build an ark because I want you and your family to be saved from this impending flood. And then also 2 of each kind of animal. So hippopotamus, alligator, whatever it might be, male and female, so they could reproduce again. But here it is. He's saying, I want you to build this ark so you could be saved from this judgment. You say, does he deserve this? No. What is grace? Well, think of it this way. You had a job last summer, maybe. Maybe you're looking to get a job this summer. You work all week. You worked your hours. You deserve what? You deserve your wages. Duh. But when you come back to it, all of a sudden your previous employer shows up in your driveway with a Chevy Silverado, a beautiful Chevy Silverado, or a Chevy Colorado, and says, hey, listen, I was just thinking about you, and I just wanted to give you this vehicle. It's yours, no strings attached. Saying, awesome. All of a sudden, oh, man, I really like my previous employer. I might go work for him again. Why? Because he just gave you something that you didn't deserve. That's what grace is. In this way that God, here he is, he gives grace to Noah. And that's what it comes down to. God's grace is a gift. It's not what we deserve. And we know that what happens in this story is that, Noah's been preaching, there's an impending judgment, help us build this ark. Everybody's mocking them. And then all of a sudden, all the animals start coming in once they got the ark built. And the floods start happening. It comes from above, the rain, and below. And very cool illustration of that on YouTube. I believe Answers in Genesis puts one out, and you could watch how it comes from up top and below, and just the catastrophic level of this judgment that God is having on the earth, and to cleanse it from all this sin. Now, it didn't fix it, because obviously there's still sin, and God's got a solution for that in the end. But at this point, this is what happens, and Noah gets through it, and he and his family, 40 days, 40 nights of this flood, and they're quarantined on this ark with all these animals and taking care of them. And I wonder how crazy that they felt like they I imagine they were going nuts. They didn't have Wi-Fi, so they couldn't Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus, whatever it might be. They couldn't get on some gaming site. They they didn't have all these things that we deal with today in our quarantine. But here it is, God's grace is a gift, and they got through it. The flood or the waters decreased. They landed, and what did they do? Noah worshipped. Noah worshipped God, gave thanks. Here it is, and God says, no more floods. No more floods as far as a global flood. And the promise was made by giving them a rainbow so they could remember, so that we could remember what God has done. So that's what the rainbow stands for. Not all those other things. It's God's promise, so we can look back and say, okay, God takes sin seriously, but he also loves us and he gives grace, and we're not being flooded right now. Even as evil as our society is, God has not flooded our society with a global flood here. But as you get into this, God's grace is a gift. Number two is God's grace is a gift to sinners. What are you talking about? Romans 5:8, it says there, but God commendeth his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We were sinners. And you say, well, you don't see the word grace necessarily in that passage, but the whole act of it is. We were sinners. We were enemies of God, and yet he's giving that grace by sending his son for us, to die for us. And the whole picture that you see with Noah is the fact that they had one option to be saved. What is that picture? Christ. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. So what you see, that's the picture from the Old Testament to the New, and connection there, the Christ connection, how Jesus came in order to give grace through his sacrifice. So when you're talking about this, God's grace is a gift, but God's grace is a gift to sinners. And you need to recognize that. Now, how in the world does that affect people, not only to receive it, but do people then in turn, can they emulate that grace to others? And that's the last one thing that I really want to focus on here is we ought to emulate God's graciousness. Now, in Luke chapter 7, you can go there. Luke chapter 7, and at the end, you find how there's this woman that comes in, and she ends up, this reaction is very interesting. So let me read this for you. It's starting in 44. Then, and he turned unto the woman and said, Simon, seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou givest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. So she was forgiven because of her reaction to Jesus? No, it's because her recognition of all that she's been forgiven of, that she worshipped Jesus, and she gave grace there. In the sense of she was bestowing this love towards someone else. Okay? Now, you could argue, well, Jesus always deserves everything that we give him, right? That's good. But yet she was turning around and she was trying to give something without, she's trying to give appreciation towards someone else because of what's been done to her. So we can emulate this thankfulness because of what Christ has done for us. Another passage in let's see here, it's 2 Corinthians 8. 2 Corinthians 8. You'll actually find something very interesting, and it can apply to our situation around us in that generosity. But it says, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. So it's actually talking here in this passage about a church that was struggling in poverty, and yet they gave so much in generosity because, they had received a lot of grace and they ended up wanting to give it to others. So it's actually a challenge. As we experience God's grace, we can give that grace to others. Now, think about this. How can we treasure God's grace this week? How can we thank Him for it? What are some specific examples of people you can show grace to this week, knowing you have been forgiven so much? I mean, even all that's going on around us, okay? How can you be generous to others and be showing and emulating that grace that God gives us? What are some specific things? Examples of actions you can take towards these people. People that are unlovable. How can you show grace? Because God's given so much. So I hope you enjoyed that today as we looked at God's graciousness and the sin. And yet, because of our sin, even though our sin was going on, we were sinners, Christ still gave grace to us. You really think about that. That's a humiliating or a humbling situation that we can be in, which should turn us to thankfulness, gratitude. And if you're not saved, I mean, it should turn you to salvation, the gospel of what Christ has done for us. So, hope you enjoy that. Have a good one, and hopefully we will see you soon.